The Last Samurai movie review. So this is one of the scripted movie review series, which actually in this case it's not going to be so scripted, it's going to be rambling because I've been looking over what I wrote and it's probably not worth reading. But anyways, the idea behind this series is that I would kind of go through the blog archives, dig up kind of old movie reviews that I did ages ago and just kind of read them out and make a YouTube video of them. Problem with going too far back in the archives though is some of this stuff was less of a coherent review and then just me going off on various tangents. Then The Last Samurai was one of it. I didn't really review the movie as such. I just kind of talked about some of the politics behind the movie. So when The Last Samurai came out in 2003, I was in Japan. And I said this on the Kill Bill review as well, but one of the interesting things about being in Japan when a Hollywood movie about Japan comes out is it's interesting to kind of see how people react to it. And there were a number of movies that came out dealing with Japan while I was in Japan. I guess, Americans like Japan. There's kind of a fascination with it. So there was, Lost in Translation, the Kill Bill movies, the Fast and the Furious 3, Tokyo Drift, Memoirs of a Geisha, some other ones that aren't springing to mind right now. Like it was a fairly common thing. There would be like about one big movie a year that had some sort of Japanese connection. And some of these movies just got completely ignored. Like Japanese people didn't even know they were released, or they come into the theaters in Japan very briefly and then go out again. And some of them were huge deals. Like everybody was going nuts. There was this Hollywood movie about Japan. The Last Samurai was one of these huge deal movies. In fact, it was probably the quintessential example when I was in Japan of something that was a huge deal. Excuse me. So, yeah, I had a few nitpicks about it. First one's kind of shorter and less complicated, so I'll get that one out of the way first. Movie actually wasn't filmed in Japan. You probably already know this. It was filmed in New Zealand. Now, fair enough. New Zealand is a beautiful place to film movies in. But I had been reading a book kind of right before this movie came out, which was popular among the expatriate crowd in Japan at the time. It's probably dated now. But it was called Dogs and Demons by a guy named Alexander Kerr, K-E-R-R, who kind of argued kind of everything that was wrong with Japan. And one of the things that he pointed out is that Japan, they've not done a good job of protecting the natural areas, so that kind of wherever you go, you can find like no place in Japan where there's not like an electrical wire hanging in the background, like even in the countryside. Countryside in Japan is beautiful. I was down in Kyushu in the countryside, and it is beautiful, mountains, rice terrace and stuff like that. But you do have electric wires kind of running through a lot of it. It doesn't completely spoil the view. But he said, this is a problem for the Japanese film industry. They can't do samurai movies anymore. They either have to do them like inside against a fake backdrop, or, try and find ways so that the electric wire doesn't crop up in the shot or something like that. So I mentioned that and said, that's probably the reason that they filmed in New Zealand. Although actually, something I've noticed just from watching directors' commentaries on DVDs of things like Lost in Translation or The Fast and the Furious is just what a pain in the neck it is for outside film crews to film in Japan. Kind of the prohibitive permits and stuff like that. So I think, who knows, maybe that was the real reason. The other bone I had to pick with this movie was about the politics of it. So the movie's not really historical in the narrow sense, but in the broad sense it is based on a kind of a broader change that was going on in that period connected to the Meiji Restoration, where the era of the samurai was going out, and the era of the kind of centralized bureaucratic government was coming in. Now, I think if you view this kind of in historical Marxist terms, it's a mixed bag, because the Meiji Restoration had a lot of things that weren't great about it. But the samurai system was awful. I mean, that was a feudal system in which kind of the samurai lords were at the top and the people at the bottom had no rights. And so I thought it was a little bit silly to romanticize all that. Kind of, for all the faults of the Meiji Restoration, I think this did kind of represent a marginal historical step forward, kind of. So, yeah, I wrote about that, and kind of the dangers of blogging, I guess, is you can write about whatever you want to, whether you know what you're talking about or not. And looking back over what I've written about, I'm not sure I entirely knew what I was talking about. So for example, I said, Lenin wrote the Meiji Revolution showed Japan's revolutionary potential, and that the groundwork for becoming a socialist state had been created during the Meiji period. I was just trying to find that quote now. I'm not entirely sure where I got that from. It must have been somewhere. But yeah, apparently, at least as I wrote back in 2003, Lenin was comparing the Meiji Restoration to the French Revolution. Now, both the French Revolution was, in Leninist terms, a bourgeois revolution. And bourgeois kind of sounds like a dirty word when you say it in leftist circles, but communists view the bourgeois revolution as being a necessary precursor to the communist revolution. So you can't go from feudalism to communism in the classic Marxist-Leninist sense. You need to have the bourgeois capitalist democracy kind of in as an intermediary stage. So that's why kind of the Marxists, at least at the beginning of the 20th century, were like in China, they were instructed to kind of join up with the Kuomintang, the capitalist revolutionaries, against the feudal system. And the directions they got from Moscow was just wait, kind of no communist revolution yet. Have the capitalist revolution first, and then you can organize for the communist revolution. I was just looking this up online to kind of make sure I knew what I was talking about, and I'm not sure I know what I was talking about. I think there was a quote I saw from Lenin or Trotsky saying that the Meiji Restoration was not equivalent to the French Revolution, that the Meiji Restoration was an unfinished bourgeois revolution, or I think Trotsky said it was a bureaucratic attempt to forestall a full-on bourgeois revolution. But either way, I think kind of whatever, I think it was kind of a step up from feudalism. Maybe, I don't know. I actually had another friend who was another history buff who was blogging about the same thing at the time. And he was saying, you know, the Meiji Restoration kind of led into the fascism of the 1930s and the 1940s. And I responded to that and I said, that's unfair. I mean, it led into it in the sense that one event kind of caused another in kind of the sense of unforeseen consequences. You know, it set in motion a chain of events which ended up with the fascist government in Japan in the 1930s and 40s. But you couldn't really say that the Meiji Restoration was ideologically that way, or that it was responsible for that. I mean, if you're going to go that way, then you'd have to say that the unification of Germany in 1870 was responsible for Hitler. In the same way, kind of, you know, arguably it set in motion a chain of events that led to kind of Hitler eventually, but that you can't blame one for the other. All that being said, I've got to admit that this guy knows more than me, and I actually remember meeting him. I wrote this when I was in Japan and he was in the US, but I think I met him up like a year later and we discussed it in person. And, you know, he was adamant about it. He said, no, 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 no. And he knows more than I do. So, yeah, I guess the point being I was writing a lot of junk about stuff I only partially understood. But my partial understanding is the Meiji Restoration is kind of a step forward. Samurai feudal system was not great. Now, I was somewhat surprised by how popular this movie was in Japan, kind of given that this was their history and maybe they should know better. Maybe that's a sign again that I don't know what I'm talking about, who knows. But I got into a conversation with a number of Japanese friends with it who were like, oh, wasn't that such a great movie? Ken Watanabe was so great in the samurai spirit. And I'd be like, yeah, but the Meiji Restoration was a good thing, right? I mean, you're glad that the samurai age died out, right? And I'd usually get kind of, yeah, but that's not the point. I asked this question at one point. It came up in the teacher's lounge. I was working in the Japanese public schools. And kind of all of the older teachers were somewhat a little bit grudgingly about it, but they all kind of unanimously said, yes, Meiji Restoration was a step forward in terms of the ordinary people's rights in Japan. The Japanese people my age, and my age being my age 15 years ago, so kind of in their mid-20s, sometimes put up more of a fight. And they said, no, 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 it's about this samurai spirit. And I said, yeah, but what is the samurai spirit? And they said, well, you know that scene where Ken Watanabe's son is kind of attacking and he just keeps fighting until he dies just to protect the samurai idea. I said, well, that's kind of stupid. All these people dying on both sides. I mean, what is the samurai idea? And it came out through the conversation. I think some of them ended up getting a little bit upset at me. It came out through the conversation that this idea of just doing your best and never giving up. And in retrospect, I should have seen that coming, because this is just such a major theme in the Japanese contemporary spirit. Just do your best, don't give up. That's kind of infused in so many of their idioms, so many of their motivational posters. And also, another thing I should have seen coming, really, is this romanticization of the samurai. Because of course Japan has a romantic view of the samurai, right? Japanese people don't wander around saying, oh, you know, the samurai represented an oppressive feudal system. I mean, like, they kind of know that. But, you know, that's not the point of these romances, any more than it would be stupid to go to, you know, a medieval romance about knights and princesses and be like, oh, but the princess is a monarchical oppressive system and the knight is a feudal, you know, like, it's just not the point. And I think that's why I kind of got so many Japanese people upset with me, kind of nitpicking after this stuff. Yeah, and that's I wrote 2 posts on it, kind of one initially after the movie, the other recounting a conversation I had at a party I went to when I got into another debate about it. And I don't think they're worth reading out for all the reasons I just mentioned, and I've kind of summarized what was in them anyways. So I'll just kind of finish here.